Welcome to the Newburyport Literary Festival online. My name is Leslie Hendrickson. I'm on the steering committee. I have just a couple of things to talk about before we get started. One is we're using the webinar format, so none of the participants are going to appear on the screen and we can't hear you, you're muted. You can use the Q&A tab down at the bottom to ask questions, and there will be time at the end for some questions. The entire session is going to last about 40 to 45 minutes. I'm also going to link some websites in the chat, one's to the Newburyport Festival website, you can learn more about our events and other today and on May 3rd, and also more information about our authors. There are also links to our independent bookstore partners, the Bookshop of Beverly Farms and Jabberwocky in Newburyport. They have all the books from our authors today at the festival, and we encourage you to support them or your favorite local independent bookstore. And that's all I have for you. Thank you very much and enjoy the panel.
Hi, I'm Liberty Hardy. I'm going to be moderating a panel today discussing What My Mother and I Don't Talk About, 15 Writers Break the Silence, which is a collection of essays edited by Michele Filgate. Michele is joining us today, as is Sari Botton and Lynn Steger Strong. I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of these authors, and then we are going to hear a little bit of their essays. I will start with Michele. Since it's her book, I guess we should start with Michele. Michele's work has appeared in Longreads, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, the Paris Review Daily, Tin House, Gulf Coast, the Oprah Magazine, BuzzFeed, Refinery 29, and many other publications. Currently, she is an MFA student at NYU, where she is the recipient of the Stein Fellowship. She's a contributing editor at Literary Hub and teaches at the Sackett Street Writers Workshop and Catapult. What My Mother and I Don't Talk About is her first book. Also joining us today is Sari Botton. She is a writer living in Kingston, New York. She is the essays editor for Longreads, editor of the award-winning anthology Goodbye to All That, Writers on Loving and Leaving New York, and its New York Times best-selling follow-up, Never Can Say Goodbye, Writers on Their Unshakable Love for New York. She is also the operator of Kingston's Writers Studio. And our other panelist today is Lynn Steger Strong. She is the author of the novel Hold Still. Her nonfiction has appeared in Guernica, Los Angeles Review of Books, Elle, Catapult, and elsewhere. She teaches writing at Columbia University, Fairfield University, and the Pratt Institute. So welcome and hello, everyone. I feel like we should all be laying on couches because we're going to be talking about mothers. So if you would each like to read just a couple of minutes, I will go back to you, Michele, if you want to start.
Sure, I'll start. I will read from the very beginning of my essay that led to this book. So it's called What My Mother and I Don't Talk About. Our mothers are our first homes, and that's why we're always trying to return to them, to know what it was like to have one place where we belonged, where we fit. My mother is hard to know, or rather, I know her and don't know her at the same time. I can imagine her long, grayish-brown hair that she refuses to chop off, the vodka and ice in her hand. But if I try to conjure her face, I'm met instead by her laugh, a fake laugh, the kind of laugh that is trying to prove something, a forced happiness. Several times a week, she posts tempting photos of food on her Facebook page. Pork tacos with pickled red onions, strips of beef jerky just out of the smoker, slabs of steak that she serves with steamed vegetables. These are the meals of my childhood, sometimes ambitious and sometimes practical. But these meals for me call to mind my stepfather, the red of his face, the red of the blood pooled on the plate. He uses a dish towel to wipe the sweat from his cheeks. His work boots are coated in sawdust. His words puncture me, tines of a fork stuck in a half-deflated balloon. You are the one causing problems in my marriage, he says. I'll slam you, he says, and I'm afraid he will. I'm afraid he'll press himself on top of me on my bed until the mattress opens up and swallows me whole. Now, my mother saves all of her cooking skills for her husband. Now, she serves him food at their farmhouse in their country. Now, my mother no longer cooks for me. And I'll stop there.
All right. Did anyone else who wanted to go next? Sari, did you want to go ahead?
Sure, I'll go next. My essay is called Brother, Can You Spare Some Change? Would you like this top? My mother holds out an animal print blouse with the price tag still on. It's something I wouldn't be caught dead in, and she likely knows it, but still she's eager for me to take it, to receive it from her. I just bought it, she says, but maybe it would be better on you. No, thank you, Mom, I say, trying to hide my annoyance and discomfort, feeling more like 13 than 23 and a year out of college. I have another shirt you might like, she says, returning to her closet. She comes back with a navy cotton Michael Stars French cut long sleeve tee, one I've borrowed from her at least once before, now dusty with the powder her dermatologist prescribes. This is more you, she says. It is. But it's your shirt, I protest. I can get another one, she insists. I'll go back to Bloomingdale's. Or do you want to go with me? I can get you a new one there. I want to get you something. I'm afraid it would hurt her if I share with her that a part of me is reluctant to trust her gifts. I worry there are strings attached. More than that, it all feels like a betrayal of everything she'd trained me to believe in and to be. Deep down, I'm also afraid that if I speak up, the giving will stop. 5 years earlier, the summer after my first year at college, I became a thief. A few times a week, I crept into my annoying 1 year older stepbrother Jared's room, dipped into his fishbowl, brimming with grimy nickels, dimes, and quarters, and snuck off with 75 cents, maybe $1. I didn't think of it as stealing. That wouldn't jibe with my long-established, uncontested role as the good daughter. I told myself I was borrowing my stepbrother's money, even though I hadn't ever asked. Also, I never made any effort to repay it. Sometimes, instead of a loan, I thought of it as war reparations. On the outwardly civil but quietly vicious battlefield of my parents' divorce, I had been the clear loser. I was saddled with two parents who, in their new marriages, were the partners with the least money, the least power, the least balls to stand up for their own kids. When I was 12, my father got remarried to a widow whose late husband endowed her and her two daughters with healthy trust funds. Each year, their grandmother, a sort of Semitic Boston Brahmin, would proudly hand me a Hanukkah card, inside of which she'd tucked one newly minted crisp dollar bill. When I was 15, my mother met a widower who let her know early on he'd prefer not to marry a woman with kids. My mother did a decent impression of a childless woman in a variety of ways. When she bought things for my sister and me, she would take us aside and whisper, "Go look under your bed. I left something for you there," so my stepfather wouldn't know. And so at 18, putting myself through school, I felt sorry for myself, and as consolation, awarded myself a small amount of financial aid from my stepbrother's bountiful change collection. What was the chance he'd notice a few coins missing here and there anyway? I'll stop there.
That's great, thank you. And Lynn, if you wouldn't mind going ahead.
Sure. This is supposed to be an essay about what I can't tell my mother, what I haven't told her. When I was asked to do this, I had that initial thrill of showing all the ways she makes me mad. But that didn't feel new or right or like it held inside most of what I feel any longer when I think of her. I have told her most of what I think. I have hurt her, she has hurt me. None of this feels secret anymore. The other day, I was teaching a gender studies class, 9 teenage girls all anxious to say the right thing, their desks in a circle. And my students and I were talking about mothers. We were talking about the impossible positions they are placed in, the ways in which they are our models. We were talking about what little space moms have to also need and also want. My students didn't notice, but I started crying. I teared up, and when the class was over, I went into a bathroom stall and sat until I stopped. I hadn't spoken to my mother in a long time. We don't speak often. I couldn't locate the specific feeling I'd had the last time we talked. I thought for a few hours after I cried in the bathroom that I would call her and I would tell her that I loved her, but I do not trust calling her. I was afraid that if I called her, she would talk, and it would be too hard for me to love her after that. What I cannot tell my mother is whatever I would have told her on that phone call, on all the phone calls in which I take out my phone and scroll to her name, stare at it, and then put my phone away. There is a gaping hole, perhaps, for all of us, where our mother does not match up with mother as we believe it's meant to mean and all it's meant to give us. What I cannot tell her is all that I would tell her if I could find a way to not still be sad and angry about that.
Great, thank you. Michelle, I'm gonna start with you. I'm gonna ask a couple of questions. I know that this was, your essay in this collection was something that you worked on for 10 years.
More than 10 years.
Yeah.
Like,
So I'm gonna kind of roll these all into like one big question for you to answer.
Yeah.
How did the idea to do this collection come about? What were you looking for when you started asking other writers to contribute? And how did you decide which essays to pick?
Yeah, so the essay collection came about because I started writing this essay when I was an undergraduate, and when I first started writing it, I thought I was writing a piece about my stepdad abusing me, but it took me years of therapy and finding my voice as a writer to realize that what it was really about was about the fracture that this caused in my relationship with my mom. And so Sari who is also the essays editor at Longreads, and she published my essay. And originally it was supposed to come out around Thanksgiving, I think we had talked about, because that's a time when people have to talk to their moms. But then the Weinstein story broke. And so the piece was moved up because the Me Too movement took off. And this was a piece that really applied to that. So when it was published, or before it was published, I wanted to call this essay Lacuna, which means like the gaps and unfilled holes. And I thought that was a great metaphor for my relationship with my mom. But Sari was like, no one will ever click on that headline. And to which I will be endlessly thankful for her for saying that, because who knew that changing the title of an essay could lead to a book deal? Because I sent her a list of headlines, and one of them was What My Mother and I Don't Talk About, and Sari said this one. So we did that, and people really didn't just resonate, didn't just like find something to see in my essay, but they really also, the title, like I started to hear from so many people who said, I have something I can't talk about with my mom, or had something if their mom is no longer here, or if they never had a relationship with their mother to begin with. And I started to realize that this is a universal topic, and so many people have untold stories. And so it quickly became apparent that this was a great idea for an anthology. And I wanted to have a wide array of stories from different backgrounds, people who have all kinds of different relationships with their moms, people who grew up in different parts of the country. You know, I just really wanted a diverse array of stories. So another thing that was really important to me and to my editor at Simon & Schuster was that this isn't just a book of stories about abuse, right? We wanted there to be some hope and some happiness in here as well. And so there are. And so I started reaching out to a bunch of writers I admire, including Sari and Lynn, and also some of the other writers in here are Kathy Hanauer, Melissa Phoebos, Alexander Chi, Bernice McFadden, Casey Lehman, Carmen Maria Machado, Leslie Jameson, just to name a few. There are a total of 15 writers in here. So I've been in the book industry for a long time. I used to be on the board of the National Book Critics Circle, and so I'm a voracious reader. And as you know, Liberty, we used to work together at River Run Bookstore in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So I've been, you know, a bookseller, and I've been writing for a long time. So it just felt like a natural culmination of my work in the community as not just a writer, but a critic, and also somebody who curates a series at Books Are Magic on women writers called Red Ink. It just felt like the next step for me in my career was to put together this anthology with a bunch of writers I admire. So that's how that happened.
All right. Lynn and Sari, how did you decide that this was something that you wanted to do? Like when you received the request, were you ambivalent about it? Were you excited about it? And how did you decide what you wanted to write about? And also, how did you feel when you had finished? Lynn, did you want to start this time?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and the piece I just read speaks about this a little bit. I both sort of felt my mother's and my relationship is very complicated, so I felt like I had things to say, but also maybe I didn't want to say them, but also maybe a lot of the things that I had to say that might have been painful have actually already been said. So I sort of took it as an opportunity to flip it. And my piece ends on what my mother and I don't talk about is that I love her. So it actually turned out to be kind of it was a very cool experience, both in terms of like what I would hope writing is, especially when I talk to students, in terms of like not knowing where you're going to end when you start. And also in terms of my mom reading it and sort of shocking us both by liking it. So yeah, it was a daunting prospect. It was fun to make it into a sort of craft exercise of, we've said so much to each other, what can I find that's new? And I did actually find things, not just in the writing, but in sort of our relationship, that shifted as a result of it.
And Sari?
Well, I tried to back out.
You did, and I wouldn't let you.
And yeah, Michelle would not let me back out. So my story is actually a merger of two pieces that I worked on for years, one of which I worked on for over 30 years. I had a similar fear of putting it out there that Michelle had been wrestling with. It's a piece I had been dancing around for a long time. Because one of the things I struggle with most is writing about family and my fear of the consequences of that. And also, like, I'm sympathetic to, maybe my family doesn't want to have it revealed that, like, in our middle-class Jewish family, there was domestic violence, which is part of the story that I didn't read. So I was very hesitant to put this out there, but also very eager to put it out there. One thing I've said many times when doing events for this book is that I've been kind of cowardly in that I have put it out there but not told my family, and also like just kind of been really creative with filters on social media to try and avoid putting it in their face, which feels cowardly, but on the other hand, it was the only way I could give this to myself. And I needed very much to putting this piece out there, finishing it, merging the two pieces together, really was the first time in a long time as a writer I didn't feel like I was self-abandoning, because I have been through a lot with my family. I've survived a lot, and I want to feel like I can tell what happened. And so, yeah, it was complicated for me to put it out there. I knew that it was going to be these stories, and I merged them. One was already called Brother, Can You Spare Some Change? The other one was called Bloomingdale's for the Soul.
Yeah, in reading this collection, I think a lot, I'm going to paraphrase here, but I think a lot about that Anne Lamott quote that is like, if your family wanted you to write nice things about you, they should have been nicer to you. It's not something to worry about when you're doing it. So talking about mothers, the stories that you've told, you're all a little ways away from these events now. At what age did you start seeing your mother as a person? At what age did you realize like she had hopes and dreams and wasn't just there for you?
Oh, that's a good question. I think for me, it probably wasn't until my early 20s. I think that like when you're a kid, you don't really think of your mom as a person, except for the role that they're supposed to play in your life, that they're mom, right? This mythical mom figure. And then when you're a teen, at least in my case, you're just like so wrapped up in your own world and how everything relates to you and what's going on that you can't always see outside of yourself. So I really think it took until my early 20s, when I was out there paying my own rent and trying to get by in the real world, that I realized more about my mom as just being a human being, and somebody who always worked a 9-to-5 job and would come home and cook dinner for us, and thinking about the sacrifices that she made, and how things were difficult for her. So that definitely, it took some gaining some perspective as an adult to realize my mom is an adult too. What about you guys?
For me, it's happened in phases. You know, a little bit in each decade of my life, more of a realization that my mom is, you know, a flawed person, but also someone who means well, who is trying. The latest, she was widowed 2 years ago, and then now going through the pandemic, she's all alone. Like, the more she needs me, the more I become aware of, and the more I fail to satisfy her needs, and no matter how hard I try, the more aware I am of her as a person trying really hard, and who has been all along. I don't have kids of my own, and that's a whole other story. So I don't have that experience of making children and then like, oh, wow, this is what my mother was going through. It's different for me. But definitely in the last few years, a lot has really hit me as our roles have reversed.
Sari, I like what you say with the phases, because I think that, Liberty, that's the best way for me to answer the question, is that it has been a lot of phases, although not least, like, one thing I'm actually really grateful to my mom for is that she was a badass lawyer my whole life. And I think that showed me a lot about how she was always something other than a mother. And I've always been really grateful to her for that. I do think the most recent and maybe obvious phase of this is that when I did become a mother, and especially now that my kids are a little bit older, and I can play in my head the narrative I imagine they're going to tell their therapist when they start to tell their therapist about all the ways I've done things wrong, you know. And I think we all, moms do things wrong, you know. And I think that is just further exemplifies something that both these guys have talked about, that you gradually realize that your mother is a human and she's flawed, and a lot of the things that she quote unquote did to you, she did because she didn't know what else to do, you know.
Do you think societal depictions of mothers in culture make children have higher expectations of their moms and make women have higher expectations of themselves as mothers? Do you think that affects how they interact? Like, did you see somebody on the TV and think like, why doesn't my mother act like that?
I mean, so I'm spending a lot of time with my kids right now, as most people are. And the thing that they always do when they're about to tell a story that they want to be scary is they kill the mother. Because that's how you put people in peril, right? Is you kill the mother and then you make the child vulnerable. And I actually think that that's true, which is my way of saying that I think there's just not enough societal depictions of mothers. You know, I think that, like, mothers are complicated and vast, and that word can be stretched in all sorts of ways. But to some extent, the fact that mother is either sort of this archetype or is absent, such that we can put people in peril, right? Because the suggestion there is that if mom was there, she'd keep you safe, which is also not possible, you know. So I think yes, absolutely, like, mothers are depicted in very specific ways, but also we should be continually considering how to depict them in different, more complicated ways.
I agree with that, and I'm sure that I felt like moms in like certain sitcoms and movies were idealized, but I think it also goes the other way, and that like, I wrote a piece for Salon years ago on, because I'm child free and I don't want to have kids, and I think that there's also this pressure in culture where there are the depictions of child-free women, childless women as like monsters, or people who are not, you know, like, I'm thinking of like the evil stepmom figure, right? Or in fairy tales, but also like this idea that you don't grow up until you have kids. That's often depicted, like in the Noah Baumbach movie. I'm blanking on the title of this. Do you guys remember? I wrote this piece like several years ago when the movie came out. But there's a movie that he did where basically the message is you don't grow up until you have kids of your own. So I just think that it's interesting that we need more depictions of mothers, but we also need more depictions of people who have decided not to be mothers.
So
Oh, sorry. My mother had to compete with Truly Scrumptious from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which sounds more like someone out of a porn movie, but yeah. I had this image that my mother was supposed to be this like happy all the time, loving all the time kind of person. But then also, as I got older and I started to see different cultural depictions of motherhood and also saw my mother struggling, it made motherhood unappealing to me. So that's.
So let's talk a little bit about sharing personal stories. If you would each mind telling me a little bit about why you feel driven to write a personal story, like about the necessity of memoir. And also I would be interested to know, Sari, you have touched on this, how you kind of have filtered this from the lives of people around you, but have you heard feedback about your essays from friends or families or family members or strangers?
Who wants to go first?
You go, Michelle.
Can you repeat the first part of that question again?
Yeah, what drives you to want to tell a personal story? What do you think drives writers to want to share personal details?
So I think it's the personal, this is said a lot, but I really believe it, the personal is political. And I think it's an act of protest to break the silences and share your stories. The subtitle of this book is 15 Writers Break the Silence. I teach creative nonfiction for a living, and a lot of my students come to me and ask for permission to tell stories that they've always wanted to tell. And I always tell them, I cannot give you permission. The only person who can do that is yourself. And there's freedom that comes with that, but there's also great pain as well. And I think it's really important, particularly women writers, that we are able to articulate some of the things that are often thought of as unsayable, unspeakable. And that's where the power of the personal essay can lie. And just the other day, there was yet another tiresome debate going on Twitter about personal essays and how people don't like them. And I always feel like it's a very gendered, misogynistic thing when this happens, because if a man writes an essay, you often don't hear of it as a personal essay. You just hear it called an essay. And so one time when I hosted my Red Ink series, it was a panel on the misfit, and Lydia Yukonovich and Melissa Febos were on this panel, and they both talked about how the idea of the confessional is a gendered thing as well. And when we think of personal essays, there is something about confessing, right? But it's not a diary, it's not a journal. You're turning your possibly like pain or something that is the most vulnerable thing that you can say into art. You're creating a story out of it, and we all respond so much to truth and to other people's stories and experiences. So to me, that's where the magic of essays lie. And I feel like essays are some of the most important work that can be out there if they're done right. As far, your second part of the question was how family has responded to this.
Or anyone, if you've heard feedback.
I have heard from a lot of strangers around the country as I've gone on book tour, and but I'll never forget this one librarian sent me an email right before the book came out, and she had just opened it up and started reading and started crying because she's estranged from her daughter, and it's the most painful experience in her life, and she felt like there was no literature out there for her to relate to understand. And in reading this book, she was able to see herself. So that to me made the whole thing worth it. And most of my family has been incredibly supportive too. And I've also, I think the best part of publishing this book is just hearing from so many people who have had conversations with their moms as a result of this, reading the book together, and they've formed their own book groups and had really soulful, important conversations that have been life-changing for them.
I got in on the action of defending personal essay yesterday when that stupid tweet went around, criticizing personal essays or just completely dismissing them as valid. And I will defend it for my entire life. It is my life's work to express myself and also help other people to express themselves. I grew up feeling like a weirdo and also feeling censored. And even though I am constantly trying to help students and people who write essays for Longreads to feel as if they have permission to tell their story, I still struggle to feel like I have permission to tell my story. This is a really complicated thing. I have a dormant but still there series on the Rumpus called Conversations with Writers Braver Than Me, where I've interviewed memoirists and essayists about their struggles to write about themselves and also tell stories that include other people, because people don't want you telling stories about them, especially if they're not flattering. And so this is like my purpose in life. And I do understand why people don't like to be written about in a negative light. I work very hard to blur people in other people's essays and also in my own work, but you can't blur your own mother and your own father. That's hard. But I think that it is so important, especially to hear from people who have been censored. Women for so long have been censored, and nobody thought their stories were important or worth telling. People of color, the LGBTQ community, people who are differently abled. You know, there are so many people who are only first beginning to be heard. And so when somebody comes out and says, oh, who needs personal essays? I get very, very angry, because there are whole groups of people who are only first now being given an opportunity to let their stories, put their stories out there. So I think it's really important. I think it's how we create empathy. We learn about other people's experiences. It's how we grow. And I also I love reading them. I love writing and reading essays and memoirs. So there.
Lynn, do you have anything that you would like to add about writing about your personal stories?
I mean, everything these ladies both so articulately said. I mean, I think, it's interesting because I'm mostly a fiction writer, and I think for me, so much of writing is about craft and form, and to do that well, you have to use everything that you have. And I just think whenever I'm talking to students, and we're all sort of teachers here, I sort of just say you have to put everything out there to understand what your raw material is. And then if you put it back together in a way that you're proud of, and in a way that you feel like is articulating something that is bigger than your experience, and that is making an argument that will matter to someone other than yourself, then it's worth that disclosure. I mean, I do think there was that great T. Kira Madden wrote this essay of sort of against catharsis a little while ago. And I don't think writers writing personal essays are writing to write about their feelings. They're writing to use their own experience to say something bigger than that experience. And if you feel enough in control of your experience to do that and understand it as such, it can feel less sort of, exhibitionary than if you were just sort of spewing your feelings out on the page, which good essayists are not doing.
Okay, we have a few questions here from virtual attendees. I'm just going to read a couple of them, and anyone feel free to jump in and answer. The first one is, do you expect more from your mother than your father, and why or why not?
I used to expect more from my mother than from my father. And then as I grew older and I became more aware of sexism, and also like some other aspects of my parents' divorce that I hadn't been aware of before, I've come to really think we don't expect enough from fathers.
I would second that.
Okay, this next question is, if we share our stories as women, can we mother each other?
Absolutely. I've been working on an essay for a while. We'll see if I ever finish it, because I have a track record of taking a while to write some essays, but on learning to mother yourself, but mothering other people as well. Yeah, that's kind of the whole point of this book, is showing that even if you don't have a good relationship with your mom, or if your mom is no longer here for you to still have a relationship with, what can we learn from those formative relationships, and how can we nurture ourselves, right? And what can we do going forward for those people who are currently mothers? How can they break the cycles that have been going on for generations in their families? How can they continue to, how can they be nurturing in a different way? So yeah, I absolutely think that that's true.
Okay. Did either of you want to chip in, or no?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And if anything, I think like it's a relief to be able to mother each other without the pressure of the word mother, right? Like there's nothing I enjoy more than loving my friends, because it's just, it's less complicated.
I do a lot of nurturing of writers as an editor and as a cohort, a part of the cohort of writers. And that work is as important to me as editing, or, we all need that kind of nurturance, especially when we're writing difficult personal stories. So that's some of the work I'm proudest of.
So the next question is, what are some of your favorite books, fiction or nonfiction, about mother-child and or mother-daughter relationships? You didn't know there was going to be a test.
I can say one, and the author is right here with us right now, which is Lynn's forthcoming novel. It's coming out in July still, Lynn, called Want, which is incredible and deals with so much of what it is what it means to be not just a mother, but a woman living in the world right now, and an artist. And but it also deals with motherhood, and I am so excited for everyone to read this book.
I recently enjoyed Emily Gould's new novel, Perfect Tunes. And she writes about a woman who becomes accidentally pregnant and becomes a mother in her 20s, when she's just starting out as a musician. And it's a lot about what it costs her as an artist to have a child and raise a child alone. And it touched a lot on a lot of the fears I had as a creative person. There are a lot of reasons I'm not a mom, and one of them was this feeling that it would put on hold all of my ambitions. So that novel, Perfect Tunes by Emily Gould, is very much about that and very good. So I recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is everyone. The Department of Speculation is often the first one that comes to mind for me, by Jenny Awful, and also Helen Phillips' The Need, which came out last year and did early motherhood, visceral physical anxiety like nothing I've ever seen. It's a great book, and just like, forget motherhood, it's one of the best thrillers I've ever read. So there's also that.
I agree. It's a fantastic book.
Yeah.
This next question asks, did you find the process therapeutic, or did it bring up more pain than necessary?
Well, again, I would point to T. Kira Madden's essay against catharsis on LitHub, that, writing doesn't necessarily translate to therapy. I would say that I needed more therapy after this essay came out and leading up to it getting published. And I think that I needed to have therapy it was therapeutic. I needed to have therapy before I could even finish writing this essay. So, but I wouldn't say that writing it and publishing it was the therapeutic part. I think it was being able to actually write it was huge for me.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with Michelle. I don't necessarily think of writing as therapeutic, but I do think that if writing doesn't hurt, you're doing it wrong.
It was hard for me, which is why I tried to back out. But it was a good kind of hard. It was something I needed to do. I needed to go through the difficulty of finally completing this piece that I had been working on in different forms for literally 30 years. It was a blessing, honestly. But sometimes you have to go through difficulty to get to something meaningful. And it has been meaningful for me, and I'm grateful to Michele.
This question here asks, do you think writing about your relationships with your mothers gives you some control over the past? Do you have agency as a writer you never had as a daughter?
That's a good
Oh
question.
yeah. I will speak to that just to say that like I'm of the belief that every writer to some extent is a pretty controlling person, right? Because it's a sort of extraordinary thing to want to do, to shape worlds completely within the context of your own brain. Like absolutely, I think that it gives you a feeling of control, but also I think it's very deceptive, you know, like just in terms of like I as a writer feel more and more in control as I get better at making books and essays that has nothing to do with my ability to say behave myself at my mother's Christmas dinner table. You know, like the two, I think it gives you a sense of control in language and in the making of books. That does not necessarily translate into being a more functional human.
I absolutely agree with that. Part of the reason I write is because you can have some control of the narrative on the page in a way that you can't in real life face to face with the person. So there is an active agency in being able to sit down and write out your own narrative, your own worldview. But that doesn't always make things easier face to face with the person. In fact, it can make it harder.
Yeah, I find that the processing of it on the page helps you to understand it, make sense of your experience in a way that you might not have if you didn't take it out of your head and examine it. But again, you still have to reckon with the person in real life, and that is a different thing from making sense of it for yourself.
This attendee asks, they say they recently read and watched Little Fires Everywhere, and they've been thinking a lot about non-biological mothers. Do any of you have mothers and other people?
Absolutely, yes. Well, I mean, I'm trying to think non-biologically speaking of, because my grandmother, who just passed away in July, was really a mother to me. And that's been like the hardest loss of my life. But some of my teachers have been like mother figures to me, have been nurturing. And I would say that I see that as my role as a teacher, is to help in some of the same ways that Lynn and Sari were talking about, that, you know, to nurture and help other people be able to tell their own stories is so important to me. So yeah, I've absolutely had mother roles or mother figures in some of my teachers.
Yeah, same for me. There's someone who had been like a mentor to me for many, many years. She was just old enough to have been my mother, maybe if she were like a teenager who got pregnant. But she was a mentor, and she nurtured me in a way that, as a writer, that I bring that into nurturing other writers myself. And I'm not a mother.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, same. I think it's always easier to find the perks in relationships that don't live under the pressure of the word mother, you know? So I think it's like there have been a lot of women in my life, especially, who have nurtured and cared for me in different ways, but also it's okay when they don't, because they're not my mother and don't have to. Whereas with mother, I feel like there's this added pressure of like, you have to do that job all of the time. Which is all to say, I don't know if they've quite been mother to me, but they've fulfilled maternal roles in moments when I've needed it.
Okay, I'm gonna finish up with one last question here from an attendee. As editors and teachers, how do you help writers sort through personal experiences and find what the piece is truly saying or needs to say?
Oh, I feel like we could have a whole panel about that, but
Right, I give you that as a quick last question.
I think, well, a few things. I think that a lot of times I've noticed that writers in early drafts will skirt around what they are trying to say. They will say everything except what they're actually trying to say. And sometimes they won't even know what they're trying to say until they reach the end of a first draft. And it might be like a sentence that's buried in there that's pointing to what they're really trying to get at. I also think that a lot of times writers, when they're writing about their own experiences, leave important details off of the page that readers need, because we don't know their lives, we don't know the people that they're writing about, right? So I think that it's easy for them to not create scenes with certain people we need to be able to see and hear and have sensory details about. So that's something also that I try to help draw out, is how do we make this come to life on the page? How do we turn this into a story that will captivate readers who know nothing about you or your experiences, but might be able to relate because something you're writing about is universal. Those are just a few points that I would make.
Yeah, I would add to that often writers forget what other people don't know about their story, especially when they're writing about the hard parts they are reluctant to tell. So I find that there's often a shorthand that you find in the piece about the most difficult parts, and I have to push a little bit harder to get those parts out of somebody. And then sometimes when it's not all coming together, when people are either deliberately or unconsciously leaving things out, I ask them, what is the question your essay is meant to either ask or answer? And that somehow helps them to focus some of the time.
I love that last thing, Sari. I feel like everything everyone said, and I would just add a couple things, not least that I always encourage students to just assume no one's going to read it until like the 10th draft, because you have to be out of control for long stretches of time with the material before you can be in control of it, and you have to know what you actually have. So you have to get it all down, and cutting is always easier than adding later. So just to be able to get everything down, have that raw material, and then shape it from that is so much easier than trying to pull things in later on. And I also think I have the sort of two-pronged thing of being merciless and merciful, which is to say, like, to be merciless about forcing yourself to make space to work, but then within that space to be merciful about how you inhabit it. So sometimes you go for a run, or sometimes you lie on the floor and stare at the ceiling and cry, but all of that is necessary. And you have to make the space for it in order to figure out what it is that you want to say.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all the panelists today. We were here discussing mothers with the editor and two of the contributors of What My Mother and I Don't Talk About, 15 Writers Break the Silence. We were with Michele Filgate, the editor, and Sari Botton and Lynn Steger Strong, who both contributed fabulous essays. I'm Liberty Hardy from Book Riot, and thank you so much to everybody today.
Thank you.
Guys.
It was great. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you so
Thanks so much.
much.